Rev, a ruthless visionary with a god complex. Shade, his loyal architect turned silent rebel. Nova, the hacker who saw too much. Deep beneath the streets of Houston, they built an empire in the shadows. A criminal underground so organized, so terrifying, the surface world had no idea it existed. But when power turned to paranoia and loyalty turned to betrayal, their hidden world began to crack. What began as a brotherhood of outcasts would end in blood, collapse, and a haunting truth. Some empires don't fall, they vanish. Marcus. Rev Calloway wasn't always a ghost in the shadows. In fact, he was once the bright light of a broken community in South Houston. A youth pastor with a magnetic voice and unmatched charm, Rev had a way of drawing people in. He preached about redemption, about second chances, about building something lasting. But somewhere along the line, that vision twisted. After the death of his younger brother in a gang-related shooting, something in Marcus broke. He disappeared from public life in 2011, just walked out one day and never came back. No one heard from him again. Not his church, not his mother, not the dozens of young people who saw him as a mentor. It was like he had been erased, but he hadn't vanished. He had simply gone underground. In a forgotten corner of Houston's downtown district, beneath an old textile factory scheduled for demolition, Marcus discovered a hidden passage. It was a rusted hatch sealed under concrete. Most would have ignored it, but Marcus pried it open and descended. What he found was a decaying network of Prohibition-era tunnels, built during the 1920s to smuggle alcohol and escape law enforcement. Now they were filled with rats, mold, and silence. But Marcus saw more. He saw shelter. He saw freedom. And most of all, he saw power. Over the next 2 years, Marcus began recruiting. Not from street corners, but from places no one was looking. Homeless shelters, juvenile detention centers, halfway houses. He gave these outcasts a purpose and a leader. They called him Rev, short for Reverend, a nod to the man he used to be. And under his guidance, they formed a group that would later be feared as the Hounds. The Hounds weren't just about selling drugs or stealing cars. They were about building a self-sustaining world beneath the surface. Rev used abandoned subways, storm drains, and utility corridors to carve out zones of control. He implemented structure, roles, rules, punishments. Members were assigned jobs based on their skills. Some handled supplies, others managed security, while a few worked as runners between the tunnels and the surface. By 2014, the Hounds had grown from a group of outcasts into a disciplined operation. But it wasn't until Ezekiel Shade Brooks joined that the empire truly expanded. Shade had a different background. Military, intelligence training, dishonorably discharged, but highly skilled. He brought organization to Rev's vision. He mapped the tunnels with stunning accuracy, installed rotating routes, decoy exits, and even ventilation systems. He turned chaos into strategy. Shade believed in the vision, at least at first. He saw the gang as a new kind of order, one that didn't rely on broken institutions or corrupt leaders. But the deeper they went into building their underground world, the darker things became. Rev began holding strange ceremonies in the tunnels. He spoke of loyalty like it was religion. He created symbols and rituals designed to bind his followers in fear and awe. One of the first major incidents that got law enforcement's attention was the disappearance of a city worker, Jordan Mays. He was part of a crew inspecting a drainage line near Midtown. He never returned from lunch. His van was found a few blocks away, keys still in the ignition. No signs of a struggle. But his clipboard contained a handwritten note. Sewer access 4B, unstable. That tunnel connected directly to a sector now under Hounds' control. Over. The next 6 months, more disappearances followed. A maintenance man, a homeless woman known as Tiny, even a new beat cop named Officer Delgado. All last seen near known access points to the underground. The disappearances were brushed off as coincidences or random crimes, until a rookie detective named Linda Perez noticed a pattern. Perez began compiling reports, maps, timestamps. She traced every missing person to storm drains or utility lines that, when plotted on a map, formed a crude circle. At the center, the abandoned textile factory where Rev had first gone underground. What she didn't know was that Rev already knew about her. One of his early recruits, a former street vendor named Clyde, had been arrested and released under suspicious circumstances. He was working both sides, feeding bits of intel to Perez while keeping Rev informed. So, while Perez thought she was circling in on them, the Hounds were watching her every move. The empire beneath the streets wasn't just surviving anymore. It was growing, learning, adapting, and above all, it was preparing for a war that no one above ground even knew was coming. By the beginning of 2017, whispers about the tunnels beneath Houston had reached the desks of higher-ups in the Houston Police Department. The strange disappearances, the odd patterns of movement in certain districts, and scattered reports of sounds echoing from under manhole covers all suggested something more organized and more sinister than random crime. A new initiative, dubbed Operation Drain, was formed under the quiet direction of Detective Linda Perez. Unlike her skeptical colleagues, she believed the truth wasn't above ground, but buried deep beneath their feet. Perez assembled a task force, consisting of forensic specialists, geologists, and veteran officers with experience in gang operations. Her team began tracing utility schematics, matching them with the access points that corresponded to the last known locations of several missing individuals. What they uncovered was disturbing. Entire sections of Houston's underground had not been mapped in over 50 years. Parts of the tunnel system simply didn't exist on paper. Those were the spaces Perez believed were under enemy control. What she didn't know was that inside those very tunnels, the Hounds were evolving into something more than just a criminal organization. They had created their own society, complete, with surveillance, trade enforcement, and even internal trials. At the heart of this evolution was Rev, whose ideology had shifted from survival to dominion. Rev believed that the surface world had failed. He preached to his followers that what existed above was rotten and corrupted. Down in the tunnels, they were pure, strong, chosen. He began reshaping the group's image into something spiritual. Every member wore dog tags engraved with their code number. Any hint of disobedience was met with severe punishment. The punishment was often carried out in what Rev called the trial rooms, sections of the tunnel that had been converted into makeshift courts, complete with crude wooden benches and flickering lanterns. Here, accused traitors or disloyal members were dragged before a jury of their peers. There was no real defense. The verdict was always guilty. The sentence was always execution. One of the first victims of this ritualistic justice was Tony Rivas, a young recruit who had joined the Hounds after being released from juvenile detention. Tony had grown uneasy with the direction the gang was heading. He had quietly planned to escape and reach out to the police, but he was caught before he could act. His trial lasted 7 minutes. His body was found 2 weeks later, buried in a maintenance shaft beneath a parking garage. His wrists were bound, his mouth sewn shut, and a wolf symbol had been burned into his shoulder. It was a clear message. Disloyalty would not be tolerated. Shade, now fully entrenched as Rev's second-in-command, began to feel the strain. He had signed on to build something organized, efficient, a shadow society. But Rev's obsession with rituals and punishment unnerved him. What was once a movement of outcasts was starting to resemble a cult. And yet Shade didn't walk away. He knew too much. He had built too much. Besides, Rev still trusted him. Or so he thought. Outside, Detective Perez continued her investigations. She finally managed to identify one of the tunnel entrances that hadn't been sealed or watched. It led directly beneath a rundown warehouse on the city's east side. A raid was planned with 2 units. Perez included. When they entered, the place was cold, silent, and perfectly staged to mislead them. Inside the tunnel, they found a few old crates, some empty water bottles, and a strange phrase spray-painted across the wall. "The street feeds on secrets." What Perez didn't realize was that this entrance was a decoy. Shade had designed multiple false wings in the tunnel system, carefully crafted to throw off any intruders. Each led to a dead end or a loop that brought explorers back to the starting point. By the time the officers left, the Hounds had already cleared any evidence, shifting their operations deeper underground. The message on the wall had been meant for Perez. Rev wanted her to know she was being watched, that the street itself was feeding her lies. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. Her department began to question the value of her task force. Some suggested it was a waste of time and resources. Others hinted she might be chasing ghosts, but Perez knew better. The patterns were too precise, the disappearances too clean. Something was down there, something intelligent, and increasingly dangerous. Inside the tunnels, Shade began to distance himself from Rev's inner circle. He started spending more time with Cassandra Nova Hill, a tech-savvy former hacker who now managed the Hounds' surveillance systems. The two shared similar doubts. They began collecting data, photos, coordinates, names. Quietly, carefully, they were building a case. But against whom? Rev's empire was growing bolder, but so were the fractures within it. Shade and Nova weren't just documenting the crimes. They were planning for the day when the crown would fall. By early 2019, the air inside the tunnels had changed. It wasn't just the stale humidity or the scent of mold and rust. It was something heavier. Fear, suspicion, the kind that clung to every breath. Rev had become increasingly paranoid. He rarely surfaced anymore and had started referring to the network as a kingdom rather than an organization. His words, once filled with hope and rebellion, now brimmed with fire, judgment, and visions of war. He spoke of a coming collapse of the surface world, of floods and fire, and of how the Hounds would rise when the rest drowned. The inner circle had grown silent, their loyalty tested by the rituals Rev demanded. Every month, new members were forced to crawl through the narrowest tunnels blindfolded while chants echoed through the passageways. Those who hesitated were marked as weak. Those who cried out were taken to the trial rooms. The gang was no longer just a system of control, it was a cult, and Rev was its prophet. But not everyone was blinded by his message. Shade, the man who had mapped the empire, began questioning the very foundation he'd helped build. He had created the structure, but Rev had filled it with madness. What had started as a plan to outsmart the corrupt systems above had become a machine of fear below. Shade still commanded loyalty from a portion of the Hounds, but even that felt fragile. He was respected, yes, but Rev was feared, and in the tunnels, fear always won. Cassandra Nova Hill had been watching everything from the shadows of her surveillance hub. Cameras hidden in drainage grates and vents fed her streams of activity throughout the tunnels. She had seen the beatings. She had heard the screams. She had recorded the trials. She kept everything, stored on encrypted drives hidden in the thick concrete walls of her quarters. Like Shade, she had once believed in the mission, a new beginning for the discarded. But Rev had twisted that dream into a nightmare of obedience and violence. It was Nova who first spoke of escape, not running, but taking control. Shade listened. Quietly, they began to form a plan, not a coup in the traditional sense. Something quieter, cleaner. They would collect evidence, enough to cripple the Hounds from the inside. They would wait until Rev was isolated, unprotected. Then they would move. They didn't share their plan with anyone else. Trust, once the foundation of their underground kingdom, had eroded. Now every word spoken too loudly could be a death sentence. But Rev wasn't as far gone as they thought. Paranoid as he was, he still had eyes and ears in every corner of the tunnels. One of his enforcers, a cold and ruthless man known only as Bishop, uncovered fragments of Nova's files. Not all, just enough to raise suspicion. Rev didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he waited. 2 days before Nova and Shade's planned extraction, Rev summoned them both to the Red Room, a sealed chamber lit by a single red bulb deep in the core of the tunnel system. It was where final trials took place, where no one left unless Rev allowed it. They entered cautiously. Rev was already there, seated on a metal throne built from scavenged pipes. Bishop stood beside him, silent and motionless. Rev began to speak, slowly, calmly, about betrayal, about wolves turning on their own, about how the pack only survives when it sheds the diseased. Nova reached for her hidden weapon. Shade's hand moved to his waistband. But Rev acted first. He lunged toward Nova, a blade in his hand. It grazed her side, drawing blood. Shade didn't hesitate. He tackled Rev with a brutal force, and the two crashed to the ground. Bishop moved forward, but Nova fired a shot into his leg, dropping him. On the floor, Shade wrestled with Rev. There were no words, no final confessions, just rage and desperation. And then, silence. Shade stabbed Rev through the chest with the blade he had hidden in his boot. Rev's body went still. They stared at him for several seconds, as if waiting for him to rise again, to speak one final curse. But he was gone. With the help of a few loyalists who didn't ask questions, Shade and Nova sealed Rev's body behind a concrete wall in one of the tunnel's collapsed zones. They spread word that Rev had fled during a raid. The story was accepted. Quietly, nervously. No one asked for proof. No one wanted to know more. Shade declared himself the new leader. He promised order, no more rituals, no more trials. Just efficiency and survival. Many welcomed the change, but some remained unconvinced. Rev's presence still lingered in the tunnels like a ghost, and not everyone believed he was truly dead. Above ground, Detective Perez had noticed a sudden quiet in the patterns. Surveillance activity had dropped. Disappearances had slowed. Something had shifted beneath the streets, but she didn't yet know how violently. By mid-2020, the underground silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before collapse. With Rev gone, Shade had taken the reins, but the control he once commanded was now fraying. The Hounds, built on fear and ritual, struggled to adapt to order and logic. The faithful who had believed in Rev's twisted prophecy began to whisper. Some even claimed he was still alive, hiding deeper in the system, watching from the shadows. The legend of Rev had not died with his body. It had multiplied. In the dark, Shade and Nova tried to maintain discipline. They streamlined the operations, drug distribution, weapons smuggling, and data theft into a structured network. Profits improved, and risks lessened. But something else worsened. Loyalty. Without fear of Rev's retribution, factions began to rise. Some led by Bishop, who had survived the bullet to his leg and now limped through the tunnels like a ghost with vengeance in his eyes. Others formed small splinter groups, hoarding weapons and supplies, waiting for a moment to strike. Above ground, Detective Linda Perez had not stopped. The decline in tunnel activity only deepened her suspicions. She believed the Hounds were preparing for something larger, and she wasn't wrong. Through an anonymous source, later discovered to be a defecting runner from the Hounds, Perez received a crude map marked with red ink. It detailed several tunnel sections, including what appeared to be a newly fortified chamber beneath a government building downtown. It was a bold expansion, one that suggested the Hounds were no longer hiding, but infiltrating. The intelligence led to a plan, a coordinated raid on 5 major access points. Perez would lead the charge, but Shade, through Nova's surveillance systems, intercepted chatter on police radios days before the operation. He knew they were coming. He had a choice: flee or fight. Shade chose neither. Instead, he orchestrated a deception. He ordered the tunnels to be abandoned. Valuable assets were moved, traps were set, and false trails were laid. When the raid finally happened, SWAT teams stormed into empty spaces filled with crumbling walls, disconnected wires, and mannequins dressed in gang colors. It was a ghost town. But just as they began retreating, a timed detonation collapsed, one of the central shafts, killing 2 officers and injuring 6 others. It was a brutal reminder. The Hounds were still watching, still dangerous. The public outcry was immediate. News channels ran with headlines like, "The War Beneath Our Feet," and "Houston's Invisible Empire." Political pressure mounted. Perez was ordered to stand down temporarily, but behind closed doors, a covert federal task force was established. The Hounds were now considered a domestic terrorist threat. Inside the tunnels, things continued to rot. Bishop began rallying loyalists to revive Rev's legacy. He promised to bring back the rituals, the purity of the cause, the fear that once made them untouchable. One night, under the ruins of the old textile factory, Bishop and his men attacked Shade's command post. Explosives tore through steel doors. Gunfire echoed through the corridors. Nova was critically injured, dragged to safety by Shade moments, before their station collapsed. The following days were chaos. The tunnels became a battlefield. Old routes were booby-trapped. Water lines were sabotaged. The fragile structure of Shade's leadership cracked under pressure. Supplies ran low. Communications failed. The empire that had once stretched beneath Houston began to cave in, literally and figuratively. In a final act of desperation, Shade made contact with Perez through Nova's emergency signal beacon. He offered her something no one had ever provided: the entire map of the Hounds tunnel system, encoded with access points, caches, and surveillance networks. In exchange, he asked for immunity for himself and Nova, and safe passage out. Perez hesitated. Shade was a criminal, yes, but ending the threat permanently was worth the cost. She agreed. In a matter of days, federal agents launched a full-scale underground incursion. Guided by Shade's intel, they sealed off hundreds of access points, raided stash houses, and apprehended dozens of gang members. Bishop was found dead, trapped in a collapsed corridor beneath the 5th Ward, his body crushed under reinforced concrete. The operation marked the official dismantling of the Hounds. Over 70 members were arrested. Weapons caches and stolen tech were recovered. But Rev's body was never found. And among the seized evidence was a grainy video, recorded in night vision, of a hooded figure walking through an unlit tunnel, whispering a chant only Rev ever used. Shade and Nova disappeared. Soon after the exchange, rumors claimed they left the country. Others said they now live under new names in a witness protection program. Perez never confirmed either version. She simply returned to her desk, one more file closed, though she often glanced at a red-marked map still pinned behind her. Houston's streets returned to normal. But beneath the city, the scars remained. And every now and then, a distant sound echoes through the tunnels. Not traffic, not rats. A whisper, like a ghost leading a pack that refuses to die.